May 13, 1943. The scorching North African sun beat down on the exhausted remnants of the Afrika Korps as they stood in long columns, hands raised, watching American and British soldiers move through their positions near Tunis. Among them was Feldwebel Otto Krebs, a former hotel chef from Munich, whose sunburned face betrayed not just the fatigue of battle, but something deeper: hunger. For months, German rations had been sporadic at best, and now, as prisoners of war, these men expected the worst. They had been told by their officers that capture by the Allies meant starvation, brutality, perhaps death. What they could not imagine was that their capture would become the instrument that would dismantle everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies, their nation, and the ideology that had sent them to war. The surrender of the Afrika Korps in May 1943 represented one of the largest capitulations of German forces to that point in the war. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had replaced the legendary Erwin Rommel just 2 months earlier, went into captivity along with 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. These men, many of them veterans of Rommel's most audacious campaigns, were marched to temporary holding compounds, barbed wire enclosures the Americans called cages, in the Algerian desert near Oran. There they waited, uncertain of their fate, watching the endless columns of American vehicles and supplies rolling past, a preview of what was to come. In early August 1943, after 4 weeks in the North African cage, the first groups of German prisoners were loaded onto transport ships for a journey across the Atlantic. The voyage took 2 weeks, and from the moment they boarded, the prisoners noticed something remarkable. The meals served aboard ship were substantial, more food than many had seen in months of combat. White bread, fresh meat, vegetables, coffee with real sugar. Some prisoners initially refused to eat, convinced the generous portions were a trick, that their rations would be reduced once the Americans knew how much they consumed. Others ate cautiously, their stomachs unaccustomed to such abundance. But the food kept coming, meal after meal, day after day, as the ships plowed westward across the Atlantic. On August 4, 1943, the first transport ships carrying German prisoners of war docked at the port of Norfolk, Virginia. As the prisoners disembarked onto American soil, many experienced a profound disorientation. They had expected a nation exhausted by war, its cities damaged, its people hungry. Instead, Norfolk bustled with activity. Its docks crowded with new ships, its warehouses overflowing with supplies, its streets filled with automobiles. From Norfolk, prisoners bound for Mississippi camps were loaded not onto the slow freight trains they anticipated, but onto sleek, comfortable Pullman passenger cars. The contrast with the overcrowded, unheated cattle cars used for troop transport in Germany was jarring. As the trains rolled south through Virginia and the Carolinas, prisoners pressed against the windows, staring in disbelief at the undamaged landscape, the prosperous farms, the seemingly endless expanse of a nation untouched by war. 2 days after departing Norfolk, the trains arrived at Camp Clinton, just outside Jackson, Mississippi. Camp Clinton was unique among American prisoner of war facilities. It would house the highest-ranking German officers captured in North Africa, including 25 generals. General von Arnim himself would be given a private bungalow with a garden and assigned a car and driver. But it was not the treatment of the generals that would prove most subversive to Nazi ideology. It was the daily reality experienced by ordinary German soldiers, the enlisted men and junior officers who made up the bulk of the 371,683 German prisoners of war who would eventually be held in American camps. The United States had reluctantly agreed to house prisoners of war on behalf of Great Britain, which faced severe housing shortages. By May 1945, the American prison system would encompass 700 camps across 46 states, from massive base camps to small agricultural work sites. The Office of the Provost Marshal General established guidelines mandating that camps be located away from urban industrial areas, in regions with mild climates to minimize construction costs, and at sites where prisoners could help alleviate the severe labor shortages created by mobilization. Most camps were built in the South and Southwest, and they adhered strictly to the requirements of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which mandated that prisoners receive living conditions comparable to those of their captors' own military forces. August 1943. At Camp Clinton, at Camp McCain near Grenada, at Camp Shelby near Hattiesburg, and at Camp Como in the northern Delta, German prisoners discovered living conditions that contradicted everything they had been taught about American weakness and decadence. Each base camp resembled a small town, complete with barracks that provided 40 square feet per enlisted man and 120 square feet per officer. The barracks were well lit, heated, and equipped with proper beds and blankets. Each group of 5 barracks had its own mess hall with tables, chairs, real silverware, and most remarkably, food prepared by German cooks using ingredients provided by the United States Army. The first meals served at the Mississippi camps sent shockwaves through the prisoner population. Breakfast consisted of oatmeal or cornflakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, and coffee with cream. Lunch might be roast pork with potato salad, carrots, bread, and ice water. Dinner offered meatloaf, more scrambled eggs, coffee, milk, and fresh bread. On Sundays, prisoners received chicken or turkey with traditional accompaniments. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same rations as their captors' soldiers, but many German prisoners initially could not comprehend this principle. In their experience, enemies did not feed each other, they starved each other. Feldwebel Hans Klein, imprisoned at Camp McCain, wrote home in a letter that somehow made it past the censors. For breakfast, we receive oatmeal or cornflakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream. For lunch, meat, always meat with vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread, and a dessert. For dinner, more meat, more vegetables, soup, bread, and coffee. On Sundays, we get chicken or turkey with all the traditional accompaniments. The letter continued with a note of bewilderment. I do not understand this country. They feed us better than we ate in Germany before the war. The statistics told a story that many prisoners struggled to believe. German prisoners in American camps received an average of 3,200 calories per day. By comparison, German soldiers in combat were theoretically allocated 3,600 calories when supplies reached them, which by 1943 was increasingly rare. German civilians in 1942 and 1943 received 2,078 calories per day. By 1945, civilian rations in Germany would plummet to fewer than 1,412 calories daily, barely enough to sustain life. Meanwhile, German prisoners in America consumed approximately 3/4 of a pound of meat per prisoner per day. The German weekly military ration included only 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish, when available. German prisoners of war in German camps received 9 pounds of potatoes per week, augmented by 5 pounds of bread and 2.5 pounds of cabbage with small amounts of margarine and ersatz coffee made from acorns. September 1943. As autumn arrived, camp authorities began organizing work details. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, though not on tasks directly related to the military effort, and they had to be paid for their labor. Officers could not be compelled to work. The minimum pay was 80 cents per day, roughly equivalent to the pay of an American private. Prisoners who volunteered for work details, and most did, were transported daily from the base camps to work sites across the South. In the Mississippi Delta, prisoners chopped cotton in the spring and picked it in the fall. In the pine lands of southern Mississippi, they planted seedlings, cut timber and pulpwood, and worked on forestry projects. At Camp Clinton, hundreds of prisoners were assigned to clear and construct the Mississippi River Basin Model, a 1-square-mile working replica of the Mississippi River and its tributaries that the United States Army Corps of Engineers would use for decades to plan flood control projects. But it was the prisoners who worked outside the camps, traveling through the American countryside to agricultural and industrial sites, who experienced the full psychological impact of American abundance. These men saw everything: the endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, the factories running 3 shifts with lights blazing through the night, the shops filled with goods, the parking lots crowded with automobiles, the farmhouses with electric lights and radio antennas. At a cotton gin outside Houston, Unteroffizier Herbert Lang watched a single machine process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village in Germany could have handled in a month using traditional methods. The gin was powered by electricity from the Colorado River, delivered through wires strung across hundreds of miles. In Germany, electricity was rationed, and many rural areas had never been electrified at all. October 1943. Prisoners assigned to work at food processing facilities experienced the most profound cognitive dissonance. At the Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, Texas, verified through Milam County historical records as employing prisoners from nearby Camp Hearn, perfectly edible produce was discarded for minor cosmetic imperfections. Tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels, beans with minor blemishes, all destroyed while German civilians faced starvation. A letter from prisoner Corporal Friedrich Müller, preserved in Red Cross archives, stated, "Today we destroyed hundreds of pounds of fruit because it did not meet canning standards. Fruit that would be treasure in Germany is garbage here." The American supervisor apologized to us for the waste. Not understanding that he was apologizing for abundance we could not comprehend. The waste was systematic, built into the American system of abundance. Camp records show that American regulations required kitchen staff to prepare 10% more food than needed to ensure every prisoner received full rations. The surplus was discarded. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, the former Munich hotel chef, wrote, "Today, we threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The American regulations require we prepare 10% more than needed to ensure every prisoner receives full rations. The surplus is discarded. I wept as I threw perfectly good bread into the garbage." Prisoners working in Michigan orchards picked cherries destined for maraschino production, those bright garnishes topping ice cream sundaes. The volume staggered them. Single orchards producing tons of fruit for decorative purposes. At canneries, prisoners observed quality control that rejected perfectly edible food for minor imperfections. Del Monte records from 1944 show that approximately 15% of fruit was rejected for canning due to size irregularities or minor blemishes, typically diverted to animal feed. In Germany, such fruit would never reach animals. It would be carefully preserved for human consumption. Sugar beet processing in Colorado and Nebraska revealed agricultural mechanization beyond German achievement. Single farms produced more sugar beets than entire German regions. Prisoners learned that American sugar production from both cane and beets reached approximately 7 million tons annually, explaining the casual abundance they witnessed daily in camp coffee and desserts. November 1943. As the first Thanksgiving in captivity approached, camp commanders planned special holiday meals. The preparations bewildered many prisoners, who assumed that even in America, with its apparent wealth, wartime would mean sacrifice and austerity. They were wrong. On Thanksgiving Day 1943, prisoners at camps across the United States received meals that seemed to mock the ideology they had been raised to believe. At Camp McCain, the menu included roast turkey with stuffing, sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cranberry sauce, fresh baked rolls with butter, and pumpkin pie. Coffee, milk, and apple cider flowed freely. The Christmas meal delivered a psychological impact from which many prisoners never recovered. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the Christmas dinner menu read like an impossible dream. Roast turkey with stuffing, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes with giblet gravy, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, fresh baked rolls with butter, mince pie, pumpkin pie, apple pie with ice cream, coffee, milk, and apple cider. Feldwebel Hans Klein wrote from Camp McCain, "We ate until we were physically ill, not from bad food but from overwhelming quantity. Our stomachs, conditioned by years of inadequate rations, could not process such amounts. Men were weeping while eating, remembering hungry families at home." The contrast struck at the heart of Nazi ideology. The Nazi Party had risen to power partly on promises to address Germany's genuine economic problems after World War I, but it had also constructed an entire worldview around scarcity. The concept of Lebensraum, living space, was predicated on the idea that Germany lacked sufficient land and resources to feed its people. Hitler and other Nazi theorists had explicitly drawn comparisons to American expansion westward, arguing that Germany needed its own manifest destiny in Eastern Europe. During one of his table talks, Hitler had decreed that Germany's duty was to Germanize this country by the immigration of Germans and to look upon the natives as redskins. The drive to clear the East of inferior populations in preparation for German colonization had led to intensive planning for the mass starvation of over 30 million people. Policy guidelines issued before the invasion of the Soviet Union stated unequivocally that many tens of millions of people in this territory will become superfluous and will have to die or migrate to Siberia. Nazi propaganda had centered German anxieties around resource scarcity. The regime had sought to exploit the biological fear of starvation and scapegoated Jewish populations and other useless eaters for taking more than their fair share. In a speech given on May 30, 1942, to a group of junior military officers, Hitler had made his position clear. The food crisis provided an ostensibly rational reason for why murder should be committed. But now, German prisoners of war in America were discovering that the premise was false. The problem was not scarcity, it was ideology, governance, and the choice to wage wars of conquest rather than develop economic systems that served their populations. December 1943. Medical examinations of prisoners revealed the physical impact of American rations. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a German medical officer imprisoned at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, documented the health transformation. The men who arrived as prisoners were malnourished, many suffering from scurvy, pellagra, and other deficiency diseases. After 1 year of American rations, they are healthier than they have ever been. Their physical transformation is remarkable. After 6 months in captivity, many German prisoners had gained 20 to 30 pounds. Their teeth improved from regular milk consumption. Their bones strengthened from adequate protein. Their skin cleared from vitamins in fresh vegetables and fruits. One prisoner later recalled that he had weighed 128 pounds when captured. After 2 years as an American prisoner of war, he weighed 185 pounds. "I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes," he wrote. January 1944. The prisoner camps had become self-contained communities with elaborate daily routines. Reveille sounded at 5:30 a.m. Work began at 7:30 a.m., with prisoners meeting quotas, 36 boxes of oranges per day at orchards in Orange County, California, for example. Those who completed their quotas early could return to camp. The workday ended at 4:30 p.m. Dinner was served at 5:30 p.m. Evenings were filled with educational classes, films, and live performances by talented prisoners. Bedtime came at 10 p.m. The camps offered amenities that amazed many prisoners. Each camp had a canteen where prisoners could spend their earnings on snacks, reading materials, playing cards, and tobacco products. They were paid in scrip rather than hard currency, but the purchasing power was real. Cigarettes were plentiful, both rationed for American civilians but freely available to prisoners. Groups of prisoners pooled their daily beer coupons to take turns drinking several at a time. Camp libraries organized reading materials, though there was never enough, an average of 1/2 book per prisoner. The YMCA printed thousands of copies of books for the camps and even provided bookbinding material so camps could repair volumes damaged by frequent use. The libraries became powerful tools of re-education, though not in the way American authorities initially intended. The camps very often included paperback editions of great works of recent German literature that remained strictly banned under censorship in Nazi Germany. Particularly in demand among prisoners were works by anti-Nazi refugee writers such as Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, Thomas Mann Zauberberg, and Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette. In an article for the Intercamp journal Der Ruf, German prisoner Kurt Vins wrote, "Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, our introduction to life, to war, and the expanse of politics would have been different." March 1944. As spring arrived, fresh vegetables appeared daily in camp mess halls. Lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, radishes. Prisoners working near schools witnessed early versions of organized school lunch programs, where American children received hot lunches including milk, protein, and vegetables as a matter of course. In Germany, school meals had been eliminated early in the war due to rationing. The National School Lunch Act would formalize America's program in 1946, but precedent programs operated during the war, ensuring that even during a global conflict, American children had access to nutrition. The formal re-education program begun by the Office of the Provost Marshal General in fall 1943 was named the Special Projects Division. Directed by a group of university professors, the program published Der Ruf, a prison newspaper edited by sympathetic prisoners, and distributed books banned in Nazi Germany. The effort was kept secret because it probably violated the Geneva Convention's ban on exposing prisoners to propaganda. The creators also feared German retaliation against American prisoners and expected that overt re-education attempts would be rejected by prisoners. But the Special Projects Division's formal efforts were largely unsuccessful. Surveys of camp prisoners found no significant change in views from the program itself. The reading material prepared by American professors, almost entirely ignorant of German language and culture, was overly intellectual and did not appeal to most prisoners. Der Ruf was unpopular as it was essentially a literary journal with little current news. What changed prisoners' minds was not propaganda. It was daily experience. The abundance they witnessed, the waste they participated in, the health they regained, the dignity they were afforded under the Geneva Convention. These experiences accomplished what no lecture or pamphlet could achieve. Summer 1944. By this point, approximately 265,000 prisoners of war were involved in some stage of agricultural production across the United States. The American labor shortage was acute. Millions of men overseas, millions more in war production facilities. Prisoners worked in canneries, mills, farms, and lumber operations. German prisoners handled materials at the Alcoa aluminum plant in Rockdale, Texas, where workers discarded more aluminum scrap in a day than German aircraft factories could acquire in a week. Plant records show that German prisoners were assigned to scrap collection, giving them direct exposure to American industrial waste at a scale incomprehensible to men from a nation that had been recycling every scrap of metal since 1939. August 1944. Among the prisoners arriving at Fort Lewis in Washington state was 18-year-old Gunter Graue, captured in Normandy. Standing in front of the camp canteen in late summer, considering what to buy first, he faced a choice that symbolized everything he had never known: an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola. He would later write, "The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, but Coca-Cola never before, so I decided to take both. I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian 1-inch. The canteen sales represented another contradiction of Nazi teachings. In Germany, such luxury items had long since disappeared from stores. Here, in what was supposed to be a prison camp, German soldiers could purchase ice cream, soda, chocolate, and cigarettes with money earned through their labor. The canteen prices were lower than outside the camps, creating the bizarre situation where American guards sometimes asked prisoners to purchase cigarettes for them. This casual inversion of the expected prison dynamic further undermined prisoners' understanding of the world. October 1944. Not all prisoners embraced their circumstances. Members of the Afrika Korps, captured early in the war during Germany's greatest military successes, often led work stoppages and intimidated other prisoners. Secret kangaroo courts tried prisoners accused of disloyalty to the Nazi cause. Those convicted were sometimes attacked or killed in a process known as the Holy Ghost. Most prisoner suicides were likely murders. The U.S. military executed 14 Germans after the war for murdering 3 fellow prisoners. 8 others served time in prison for 2 additional murders. However, dozens of such murders may have occurred. At some camps, devoted Nazis remained loyal to their political beliefs and expected a German victory until the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945. The violence reflected a deeper ideological conflict within the camps. Early prisoners, thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, viewed later prisoners captured in France with contempt, calling them traitors and deserters. One prisoner later stated that there was more political freedom in the German army than in an American prison camp, referring to the terror exerted by committed Nazis over others. American authorities eventually separated the most violent Nazi adherents, sending them to segregation camps in Oklahoma, while anti-Nazis were sent to Camp Ruston for their protection. December 1944. On December 23, 25 German prisoners broke out of Camp Papago Park in Arizona by crawling along a 178-foot tunnel. Their plan was to travel down a nearby river by raft to reach Mexico, then somehow make their way to Argentina. The river turned out to be a dry riverbed. By January, all the escapees were caught. This escape attempt was unusual, Less than 1% of all prisoners of war in America attempted to escape, about half the rate of Italian prisoners and less than the rate in the civilian prison system. Most prisoners who attempted escape later admitted that boredom, not ideology, motivated them. The likelihood of returning to German forces overseas was virtually zero. Prisoners who died during escape attempts usually received military funerals with U.S. government-provided German flags, another gesture that confused men raised under a regime that showed no such mercy to its enemies. January 1945. As the new year began, the war in Europe was entering its final phase. News from home grew increasingly dire. Letters from families described bombing, starvation, and the advance of Soviet forces from the east. In the camps, prisoners continued to receive 3,200 calories per day, while their families subsisted on rations that had fallen below 1,500 calories. The psychological torment of this reversal was immense. Some prisoners wrote letters begging their families to somehow arrange their repatriation, only to receive responses telling them to stay where they were, that conditions in Germany were far worse than any prison camp in America. April 1945. After the liberation of Nazi concentration camps, films of the atrocities of the Holocaust were shown to prisoners with armed military police present. The footage engendered shock, anger, and disbelief. Amazed and disbelieving prisoners nicknamed them Nochen films, films of bones. Many prisoners insisted the films were propaganda, that the atrocities shown could not possibly be real. But others were shaken to their core. After compulsory viewing of an atrocity film, 1,000 prisoners at Camp Butner burned their German uniforms in protest. Prisoners at other camps called on Germany to surrender. A few prisoners even volunteered to fight in the war against Japan, an offer seriously considered but ultimately rejected by American military officials. May 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. At its peak that month, the United States held 425,871 prisoners of war, 371,683 Germans, 50,273 Italians, and 3,915 Japanese. The prisoners expected immediate repatriation. Instead, they remained in American camps for months, in some cases more than a year. President Harry Truman decided that a labor shortage existed in the United States and that prisoners should remain to help with the harvest and other critical work. The Geneva Convention technically no longer applied after the war's end, and pressure from American civilians who resented the good treatment of prisoners led to changes. In May 1945, the Office of the Provost Marshal General limited available food and ended canteen food sales. Civilians had complained that the prisoners were eating too well. Even with reduced rations, German prisoners continued to receive more food than German civilians would see for years after the war. August 1945. Before being sent home, prisoners were required to watch documentaries of the Nazi concentration camps. For many, this was their second viewing, reinforcing what they had seen in April. Scholar Arnold Kramer noted that in his years of interviewing former prisoners, he never met one who admitted to being a Nazi. Most Germans had some knowledge of the camps, but how much those captured in North Africa in 1943 knew of the Eastern Front, where most atrocities occurred, remained unclear. Alex Funk, a prisoner who served as military chaplain to fellow prisoners at Camp Algona, said that while aware of Nazi persecution of Jews and the existence of concentration camps, he only learned of the extent of the Holocaust from media reports after the camp's liberation. The Gestapo had considered Funk politically unreliable before his capture in North Africa because of his participation in the Confessing Church. The 3 years in the camps had transformed most prisoners in ways the architects of formal re-education programs never anticipated. Citing 80 fellow prisoners with whom he corresponded after returning home, Funk reported that no formal re-education had been necessary in the camps because they had become convinced Democrats due to their treatment. Another prisoner, Alex Funk, later wrote, "The 3 years in the camp were no lost, useless time for us in the course of our lives, but a lifting experience which has shaped us." He noted that they had all been positively impressed by the United States and that we all had been won over to friendly relations with America. 1946. Throughout the year, prisoners gradually returned to Germany. Most left the United States with positive feelings about the country where they had been held, familiarity with the English language, and often with several $100s in earnings, substantial sums that would benefit the post-war German economy. They had benefited from being held by a nation that largely did not hate German soldiers. A November 1943 poll had found that 74% of Americans solely blamed the German government, not Germans, for the war. This distinction, maintained throughout the conflict, meant that American guards and civilians generally treated German prisoners as fellow human beings who had been misled by a criminal regime, not as irredeemable enemies. After repatriation, about 5,000 German former prisoners emigrated to the United States. Thousands of others returned later to visit. Rudiger von Wechmer, a former prisoner, lived in New York City for 14 years as the German permanent representative to the United Nations. Many future German CEOs benefited from education they received as prisoners in the United States, where educated prisoners taught classes on their areas of expertise including German, English and other foreign languages, business, and mathematics. The systematically taught courses were so successful that in May 1944 the German Ministry of Education and the OKW sent detailed procedures through the Red Cross for students to receive credit at German high schools and universities. The final statistics told a story of an ideological defeat more complete than any military victory could achieve. Over the course of 3 years, the United States had held 425,000 prisoners of war, mostly German, in 700 camps across the nation. These prisoners had eaten 3,200 calories per day, while their families survived on 1,400. They had gained weight while their countrymen starved. They had witnessed abundance so extreme that perfectly good food was thrown away while Germany's cities burned and its people scavenged for scraps. They had seen American factories producing weapons and goods at scales that dwarfed Germany's total industrial output. They had been treated according to international law by a nation they had been taught to despise as weak and decadent. And they had returned home to rebuild Germany, carrying with them the knowledge that everything they had been told about the world was wrong. The German prisoners of war held in America during World War II were part of what the Associated Press later called an all-but-forgotten part of history, even though some former inmates went on to become prominent in post-war Germany. About 860 German prisoners of war remain buried in 43 sites across the United States, with their graves often tended by local German women's clubs. Even in the communities which formerly hosted camps, local residents often do not know the camps ever existed. Yet the impact of those camps rippled through post-war Germany in ways both subtle and profound. The waste that so traumatized Feldwebel Otto Krebs, the excess bread thrown in the garbage, the rejected fruit diverted to animal feed, the surplus rations prepared and discarded, was not cruelty. It was abundance so extreme that it could afford to be careless. That abundance, more than any propaganda film or re-education lecture, destroyed the ideological foundations of Nazism for those who witnessed it. The Nazi regime had built its appeal partly on the genuine problem of feeding Germany's population within its pre-war borders. Hitler had argued that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, conquered from inferior peoples to the east. The hunger plan, the mass starvation schemes, the wars of aggression, all were justified by the alleged necessity of securing resources for the German people. But the German prisoners in America learned that the problem was never scarcity. America had been in a global war for years, sending millions of men overseas, transforming its economy to produce weapons at unprecedented scales. By 1944, the United States was producing half of all weapons used in the war. By 1945, America was responsible for half of all products manufactured in the world. American industry provided almost 2/3 of all Allied military equipment produced during the war: 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks. The average Ford car had some 15,000 parts. The B-24 Liberator long-range bomber had 1,550,000. One came off the line every 63 minutes at Ford's Willow Run plant. Yet even while sustaining this massive military production, America continued to feed its civilian population at pre-war levels, maintained agricultural output that fed Allied forces worldwide, and provided captured enemy soldiers with 3,200 calories per day plus access to canteen luxuries. The United States had not conquered vast territories to feed its people. It had not enslaved populations to secure resources. It had developed an economic and agricultural system so productive that it could afford to throw away food that Germans would have treasured. The ideological implications were devastating for those who understood them. Nazi Germany had pursued a catastrophic war partly based on the false premise that only through conquest and racial domination could a modern industrial nation feed and sustain itself. America proved that free societies with market economies and democratic institutions could generate prosperity beyond anything the Nazi regime had achieved even at its peak. The casual abundance in the POW camps, the daily waste, the Christmas feasts, the canteen Coca-Colas and ice cream, represented a refutation of Nazi ideology more powerful than any military defeat. When the prisoners returned home to the ruins of Germany, they carried this knowledge with them. They had seen an alternative. They had lived it for years. They knew that the hunger and destruction surrounding them was not inevitable, not the result of insufficient living space or racial inferiority, but the consequence of a regime that had chosen war over development, conquest over commerce, ideology over pragmatism. Some former prisoners became leaders in rebuilding post-war Germany, applying lessons learned in American camps about democracy, economic systems, and human dignity. The prisoners of war program cost the American government millions of dollars to operate. The government received $22 million in 1944 from prisoner wages, and estimated it had saved $80 million that year by using prisoners in military installations and agricultural work. But the strategic value extended far beyond these figures. The 371,683 German prisoners who passed through American camps became, in effect, ambassadors of American values to post-war Germany. They returned not as men who had been brutalized by their captors, but as men who had been fed, healed, educated, and treated with dignity. This treatment, more than any Marshall Plan dollar or military occupation policy, helped ensure that post-war Germany would reject Nazism and embrace democratic governance and market economics. The story of German prisoners in America represents one of history's great ironies, that America's adherence to international law and humane treatment of enemies served its strategic interests better than any violation of those principles could have. The Geneva Convention requirements that seemed burdensome to some Americans, feeding prisoners the same rations as American soldiers, providing adequate housing, allowing cultural activities, paying for labor, became tools that undermined enemy ideology more effectively than propaganda ever could. The prisoners learned through daily experience that free societies could be strong, that democracy could be efficient, that abundance could be achieved without conquest. When Otto Krebs wept while throwing away excess bread, he was mourning not just the waste but the collapse of the worldview that had shaped his adult life. When Gunter Grass stood in front of the canteen deciding between ice cream and Coca-Cola, he was experiencing a cognitive dissonance that would permanently alter his understanding of what was possible. When prisoners gained 30 pounds eating American rations while their families starved, they were living proof that the Nazi explanation for Germany's problems was false. The abundance they witnessed, the waste that shocked them, the treatment that confused them, these were the instruments that destroyed Nazi ideology more completely than any military victory ever could. The camps have been demolished, the prisoners have aged and died, and the extraordinary chapter of 425,000 enemy soldiers living in American camps has faded from popular memory. But the legacy endures in post-war Germany, in the democratic institutions that former prisoners helped build, in the economic prosperity that proved Nazi theories of Lebensraum were unnecessary, in the peaceful relations between former enemies. The German prisoners of war in America discovered that abundance was not a zero-sum game requiring conquest and domination, but the product of systems that respected human dignity and individual initiative. That discovery, more than any battle or bombing campaign, helped ensure that the Second World War would be not just a military defeat for Nazi Germany but an ideological one from which the regime's poisonous philosophy would never recover.